And welcome to Constitution Corner. I'm Robert Owens. No bow tie tonight, but I appreciate you guys all being here today. And, I'm really excited to talk about solutions. There's lots of problems and everybody belly aches about problems. And boy, have we got some. The inflationary aspects of what the Fed has been doing is really starting to hit home in a major way. We've seen this with building supplies, lumber. I mean, it is going crazy right now, what's going on with prices. And I think, for me, one of the real insidious aspects of this is that these Wall Street bankers get the first use of this money. And as a result of that, there's a huge disparity between the have and have nots, and not because of any extra work they're doing or they invented something cool that everyone wants, but only because of their connection with the federal government and the monopoly they've put in that position. So I think people are really starting to see this. It's starting to hit home. So it's incumbent upon us with the John Birch Society to make sure that we're adequately informing people about this so that we can get this information out. But today I'm going to talk about nullification. And one of the great aspects of nullification is that it is like a surgical tool to cut out federal excess. And it's so much of a better solution than, for example, the Article 5 Constitutional Convention, which is like a meat hammer opening a Pandora's box of problems. And as lawyers, one of the things we always talk about is trying to successfully achieve goals without opening a whole portfolio of risk at the same time. And that's what nullification is all about. So we're going to talk about this in detail, and let me first start by introducing some of the history of it. And I should say the John Birch Society and the New American has some tremendous materials and work that has been done in this field. So a lot of this will be a summary of those pieces of work that are already out there, but hopefully in a way that's very explainable. So first of all, understand that nullification has a significant history, not just legally in the United States, but worldwide and biblically. So I'll give you a couple examples as we warm up to this. First, from a biblical perspective, we see in the Old Testament where Pharaoh instructed the Hebrew midwives to murder all male Jewish babies, right? And these Hebrew midwives interposed themselves. And they said, no, we're not going to follow that law. Now understand, that was the just, valid law because Pharaoh had complete lawmaking authority in that civilization, and so the lawful thing to do would have been an effort to follow Pharaoh. But the Hebrew midwives interjected themselves, and they put themselves in position. They interposed themselves between Pharaoh and those babies because they knew what was morally right, and God blessed them for that, right? So we see a specific example of God blessing this aspect of interposition, and it's very noteworthy from that standpoint. Fast forward, 2,000, well, a lot more than 2,000 years, and we see an example in Germany in World War II where a fellow by the name of Schindler interposed himself again on behalf of Jews. To say, look, we're going to hide these people in my factory from the Nazi laws. Now, the Nazi laws, those were civil laws that were passed by the then existing government. So, these prison guards and all these other folks that were on, in these concentration camps could try to make some claim to it. But what was right was to interpose themselves. And that's exactly what Schindler did. And I think that, history has vindicated that position rather admirably. In our own history, we have seen examples of nullification being very effective and worthwhile. So one of the things that I find has the most resonance, and maybe this is more so in northern states, and I'm from Ohio, I cover Indiana, Michigan, and Western Pennsylvania, so it plays very well here, is to talk about the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act that was signed by Millard Fillmore into law. Now, among many problems that the Fugitive Slave Act had was that it did not provide any due process to somebody that was Black. So, for example, if you were found in a northern state and you didn't have appropriate paperwork, and I can assure you in 1850, it's not like they had plastic driver's licenses and all kinds of good paperwork. Well, you could be rendered down south, even if you were, a freeman, and you would have virtually no rights and nothing to prevent that from happening. So a number of states passed nullification efforts that just simply said, hey, we're not going to permit that to happen in our state. In Michigan and in other states as well, for example, any lawyer that was involved in slave rendition was immediately disbarred. Any judge that was involved in slave rendition was tossed out of office. And it was a crime in several states to even be involved in it. And the sheriff was specifically tasked to interpose himself with any federal agent that would be engaged in slave rendition. So there's a proud history of doing the right thing on a moral basis to use nullification. And I think that's the aspect that we need to approach legislators with, so that they understand that we're not talking about secession. We're not talking about something that's anti-American or wrong. We're talking about something with a firm biblical root that historically has been morally correct, not just in our country, but abroad, and has strong moral basis for action. Now, it's further worth saying that where we get nullification from as a constitutional principle has firm historical roots as well to show its validity. So we go back all the way to 1783 and the Treaty of Paris. And one of the things that's noteworthy about the Treaty of Paris, and just as a recap, following our war for independence, and the Battle of Yorktown, the Treaty of Paris is what King George III signed that ended hostilities and ended the War of Independence. And what's important to note here is that the Treaty of Paris doesn't grant independence to one United States of America, but rather the Treaty of Paris grants specific independence to 13 individual sovereign states, and it lists them all out. Very specifically, so that we know that where this started, based on our Declaration of Independence and the War of Independence that we fought to make it stick, is that that independence was granted to 13 individual states. Those individual states then signed a compact in which they ceded only specific enumerated powers to a national government. The first effort was the Articles of Confederation, and then they had another convention in 1787 and changed it to our current US Constitution. But again, in those efforts, and as you can see very clearly in the Federalist Papers and in the ratification debates that followed, only specific enumerated powers were delegated to the federal government, and everything else was retained by them. And just to make sure about that, there was quite some effort to pass the Bill of Rights, which, if you've seen Overview of America, should rightfully be named the Bill of Limitations on Government. We get to the 9th and 10th Amendment, and sadly, when I talk to students of history, when I talk to even lawyers, and I ask them, what's the 9th and 10th Amendment? Most of the time, they've got no idea at all what the 9th and 10th Amendments are. But these are critical pieces of the fabric of our system of a republic style of government. And basically, to boil it down, it says this: hey, the federal government only has certain enumerated powers, and if they're not specifically delegated, those powers are reserved to the states or to the people, respectively, and not at all to be exercised by the federal government. And it's on that basis by which we draw upon this constitutional doctrine of nullification. And it should be noted that the first nullification bills were drafted in response to something called the Alien and Sedition Acts that were passed in 1798 by the Adams administration, which essentially made it illegal to say bad things about the government. And it's more complex than that, and I'm simplifying it for purposes of our discussion. But in essence, Jefferson and Madison wrote pieces of legislation, both for Kentucky and Virginia. And then there was also something called the Report of 1800, also a piece of legislation that said, hey, that's not going to be enforceable in our state. And so one of the things that is attached and sent out by Ed, and I appreciate Ed getting that out, is a model nullification bill that has sort of fill in the blanks. And it really takes almost verbatim the language that was drafted by Jefferson and Madison and puts that together so that you can apply that to a number of different issues as it's going forward and useful in that aspect. So that's the history of nullification that gets us to today, to the point where we can say, hey, this is a valid tool, it works, it's constitutional, it's ethical, it has a long-standing biblical and worldwide usage that is moral and makes sense, and it is something that we can follow today. And also, I should point out that something like a Convention of the States or an Article 5 Constitutional Convention, this takes forever. I mean, Meckler points out that he's been at it for 7 years and he's barely halfway through, but nullification is something that's a far more immediate answer. And I think to anybody that we're talking to, whether it's a state legislature or fellow citizen, we should point out that we don't have time right now to mess around. We have to have action this day if we're going to save our republic. And this harebrained scheme of a constitutional convention is just a long road to nowhere, where nullification is immediate action this day, and that's what we need. So that's the sort of long wind up to where we're going to talk about some specific things that can be done both at the state and local level. So a couple things, let me start at the local level before we get to the state level. And one of the other documents that was pushed out by Ed is a local resolution to be passed at the county level. And what this simply says is that, hey, it reaffirms aspects of the Second Amendment, and it's maybe symbolic and ceremonial that it doesn't quite have the same teeth that a state action has, but there's a couple things that are important. One, if we're going to get these bills passed through the State House, we need to build a disciplined army that's excited to get things passed, right? So working at the local level, at the county commissioner level, we can use this opportunity, even if it's mostly symbolic, to put a team together and get people actually energized and working. Also, we have found that just from an aspect of teamwork environments, success begets success. So when you have an environment where you get a local county board of commissioners to pass something, that's an aspect of success, and you can get members excited about that. And I know I'm talking to a lot of leaders here, and so as a leader, you want to find a way to get your members a tangible success item that they can go around to it. But here's the aspect where it goes even beyond the ceremonial or symbolic aspect. It gives you an immediate connection with your local county sheriff, right? Because here's something that's passed by the county commissioners, and at least in Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, the local sheriff has to go to the county commissioners for their funding. So if the county commissioners say something, they take that seriously, and it gives you an outlet to go to your county sheriff then, and then open up the dialogue to talk about the constitutional role of a county sheriff, that they are in fact the law in that county and not the federal government. And that it could very well be that as the sheriff, they will need to interpose themselves against the federal government and protect the people in their jurisdiction, and that's their constitutional obligation. And so this local resolution that we've pushed out, in addition to helping build your team and getting a victory that can make sense, also opens the door to that conversation with your sheriff. And I think it dovetails very nicely into our support your local police and keep them independent. So if you're not aware, our support your local police task force has a quarterly intelligence briefing that has wonderful articles about like who is Antifa and where's their funding and who were they founded by, who is Black Lives Matter, where is their funding, and you know who is behind them to begin with, right? And so to put those in the hands of your sheriff as well really starts moving the ball towards what we want to achieve getting forward. And what's interesting about this and what we have found from a success standpoint, and we've got I think over 33 counties in Ohio. Out of Ohio has 88 counties, 33 counties have already passed an aspect of this resolution, a sample of which is attached. And we're working in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Indiana to get more counties to pass it. Is that you can rally together 30, 40 people, show up at a county commissioners meeting, get them involved in it. It feels like the world's coming down on them. And of course, they don't want to be seen as anti-Second Amendment, and they can be very powerfully persuaded. And I know even behind the Iron Curtain there in New York, you know, I know that you guys have, you know, population centers that sort of lead the rest of the state around by the nose. But certainly in the rural counties, I think you'll find that this resolution will be very well appreciated and accepted. So now let's transition to the state level, and we'll talk about some different concepts of nullification that can be put into play, and then we'll talk about the specific strategies of how to get those accomplished at the state level. So first of all, let's talk about the types of nullification bills that make sense. So first and foremost, what we have found that gave us the most traction to immediately start opening dialogues with members of the state legislature was the Second Amendment Safe Haven Act. And so what this bill says in Ohio is that, hey, any federal firearms laws are null and void in the state of Ohio. Basically, it wipes out all federal law dealing with a firearm and makes it of no application in the state of Ohio. And one of the things that's really fantastic about this is that because the John Birch Society has nullification as a national action item, we have members all over the country that have been working on this. And as a result, 6 states have already passed this, and it's pending in 12 more. And so that's fantastic. And when I say that to state legislators, when we're in committee and just in private meetings, you can see the sort of aha moment of, oh, okay, we're not doing anything radical or unusual here. We're really going in a mainstream sort of action. And of course, you know, in many states where they've passed marijuana, you know, legalization laws, that's essentially what they've done as well, is they've nullified federal law with regard to marijuana being a controlled substance. And so now they can see that, all right, well, this doesn't like crash the union. It's not secession. It's not anything crazy. This is a normal constitutional step. Another aspect that we just saw recently that I think also is a good corollary to bring up is that in many states, including Ohio, if the legislature passes a law and the governor vetoes it, there's a process by which the legislature can then override that veto, right? And it's a legislative process. Well, in many respects, nullification is sort of like a override of a veto. It's an override of a federal law that is inappropriate. And so it's very much part of the normal constitutional legislative process. It's just one more tool in the legislator's toolbox, and it's not a tool that should be neglected. And in fact, sadly, it has been too far neglected. And a lot of times just because it's a tool that the carpenters don't know how to use. So we've just got to re-educate those carpenters as to that being the case. So that's the aspect of it. Now, again, other ways in which nullification can be used at the state house level. Congress has passed H.R. 1. There's another version called Senate Bill 1. And this is a bill that blatantly violates Article 2 of the Constitution with regard to how presidential elections are being done. It's essentially a federal power grab of election systems. And it's just not even close to being constitutional. So here's another example in which states are very well in their rights to say, hey, this bill we're specifically not going to allow to take place in our state. And so because it's a blatant violation of Article 2, and I mean, you can point right to it. Hey, the Constitution says only state legislatures may pass rules with regard to presidential elections. It allows that easy dialogue, and it makes sense. And in fact, it puts opponents of a nullification bill on the wrong side of the Constitution just by the black letter reading of it. And there's no way to find a penumbra or an emanation or some way around it. I mean, it's very clear black letter law from that aspect. So we can go and take that further. So aspects dealing with federal mandates on transgender men participating in women's sports. This is another area that we can use nullification with. In schools as well, and one of the bills that we've been working on, we've got introduced in the Ohio House, we're about to have introduced in the Ohio Senate, something I call the backpack bill. And what this bill does, it says that parents have the right to take their kids out of a public school, and whatever funding that would go to that public school for that child would then follow the child to however the parents would then self-direct it. Now in Ohio, that means on the low end, like $9,000, and at the high end, over $20,000 per child, right? So as a parent, I can pull my kid out of their public school. My kids don't go to a public school, and send them to a private school. And all of the funding that would normally go to that school will then be directed back to the school of my choice. Even Freedom Project Academy, as would be the case. So those are ways in which we can use state laws to sort of cut off things like critical race theory and the 1619 Project, and restore an aspect of free market enterprise to the school system as well. Now, one of the aspects that you're going to get is, you know, the federal or the state government starts pushing back on the federal government, is this statement, and I've heard it from state legislators so many times. Well, the federal government's going to cut off our funding if we do this. We're not going to have money for roads, and we're not going to have money for this and that. And I say, hey, this is the point where we remind them, where do they think this money's coming from anyway? Right? I mean, we need to take control of this scenario. So another bill that we have pending and coming through is what I call the escrow bill, and it uses these aspects of nullification. What it says is this, that the people of state of Ohio, state of Michigan, wherever, don't pay your federal tax money to the IRS. Make the check payable instead to the treasurer for the state of Ohio, send it there. The Attorney General of the state would then be in charge of indemnifying each citizen against the action taken by the federal government. The state legislature will then determine from that escrow, from those monies that are escrowed in the state treasury, what funds are due and payable to the federal government to exercise their Article 1, Section 8 duties, remitting then only those funds in proportion to the population of that state associated with Article 1, Section 8 duties, and then refunding the balance back to the people of the state. And in that way, we can circumvent this aspect of, well, the federal government's going to cut off funding. No. We're going to cut off funding to the federal government. And that's how states can sort of reassert their power and reassert their sovereignty in this process as it's supposed to happen. So there's a number of other things. I don't want to belabor the point too long, but let me talk then specifically about strategy, right? Because we have to have a strategy in place. One of the brilliant aspects of Napoleon, as we study, European military history, is that he understood tactics, and he brought a whole sea change of how to do things. So first of all, he was brought up as a young artillery officer. So he had knowledge of the use of artillery. And he understood that artillery was meant not as a, hey, let's siege a fort and use it to pound the fort into submission. He understood siege warfare was a mess. Even Sun Tzu will tell you siege warfare is a bad idea. He understood artillery was to be used as field artillery, and the goal was to pin the enemy and make them immobile. Give you an opportunity to survey the landscape then, and then find the weak areas and use your mobile forces to attack those weak areas. So we're going to adopt some of those same concepts and principles in a legislative fight. And here's how we do it. First of all, we use artillery by using our Act Now and some of our tools to get people to really start barraging the state legislature on an issue. So, for example, in Ohio, House Bill 61 says no transgender men may participate in women's sports, right? So in that particular case, we will have a 3-week period where we will get all of our members to literally focus on just that bill. First, it'll be sort of a barrage to all of the Ohio House, but then we dial it in and we focus on only those members of the subcommittee that the bill has been assigned to, and more importantly, just the members of the subcommittee that are critically important to get the vote out of the subcommittee. Right. So we have to do some research work, and we find that, hey, you want to target the chairman of the subcommittee, you want to target the vice chairman of the subcommittee, and then you need to do a survey of that subcommittee to find out who's for and against, so you can have the necessary number of votes to get it out of subcommittee. And then at that point, forget sending messages, emails, phone calls to anybody else in the Ohio House, or in the House of Representatives, even if that's your constituent. You want to only focus on those key members. And what we found, for example, on some of these nullification bills is by doing that, all of a sudden the chairman of the subcommittee shows up as a co-sponsor on the bill, right? Because his or her phone's been blowing up on the issue, right? And so in that aspect, then we can then target it. Now, on our backpack bill, for example, there's a Republican in charge of the subcommittee that bill needs to go through. And we can look and we can see they've taken a lot of money and a lot of funding from school unions in the past. So, all right, well, that's going to give us a pretty good clue. So now we can realize we've got to have a strategy to deal with that. And it's going to take more than just artillery. It's going to take, an application of ground infantry. So in this aspect, we're marshaling our forces and even getting folks from surrounding counties to come in and assist. And we're having days in which we're going to take literature about this bill and we're going to drop them in key precincts in that representative's district. Right? So that all of a sudden her phone's blowing up from people, her neighbors, right? People that are key donors to her campaign. Hey, what's this piece of information that says that, you're supporting critical race theory by not, taking on this bill? Do you really support critical race theory? And we sort of pound her by use of infantry in this case, and finding those weak spots. And in that process, we see the legislation moving forward. So these are those key aspects. And then, once you get it through committee, then you have to ascertain where the votes that are needed. Specifically, the Speaker of the House is going to be key, and make sure that we use that same tactic again to really focus our efforts on that office. What I find is that, hey, when you start at the local level and you build a successful campaign and your members can see, hey, we've had success here, right? It gets them excited for the next success, right? And then when you target the committee and you get the bill through committee, right, the members feel great because, hey, now you've had success. You've gotten the bill through committee. And now that you're only asking them to call a few members of the legislature, right? It's a great aspect because it's not going to take a ton of time to get it done, and they get excited because they've already had success. So these are some of the key strategies that we can use to really move the ball and get this done. Ed, that's the comments I have. I'll be happy to take any questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Robert. That was great. That was fantastic. I mean, when you can start to see some of the practical application of this whole theory of nullification, it makes you think we can get it done in certain areas. And particularly in upstate, you're certainly right, focusing on the rural counties. These rural counties are they primarily voted for Trump. They are counties where the sheriff generally has refused already to implement the New York State gun bill, the Cuomo's gun bill, and the sheriffs are not enforcing it. So they already know about nullification, and here we have other applications to approach them with. So that's good. Let's have you unmute one at a time, if I could, and any questions for Robert. We're going to take about 10 minutes of questions, if that's okay, folks.
I have a question, Ed. It's Candy in California right now.
Okay.
Hi. I'd like to know, how could we use nullification to handle the bogus election that just occurred? I'm from Michigan, been following Michigan, Maricopa County. There's a judge threatening to overturn the election in Georgia right now because he's seen that there's cheating on ballots, et cetera. They're all in, all these states are investigating. How can we use nullification?
Okay, good question. Thank you, Candy. Go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, so specifically what I would say is nullification bills that would nullify any passage of HR 1 or Senate Bill 1, I think is critical. And here's the thing. In each of these efforts, what we have to remind ourselves is that we need to accomplish multiple goals at the same time. So one, we want to get this bill passed so that we can make sure that we don't have federal takeover of our election systems, because they're already bad enough. But if Congress takes them over, then they're going to be almost a hopeless mess at that point. But at the same time, we're building our team, right, to get meaningful legislation passed. So if we start by nullifying House Bill 1 and Senate Bill 1, then along that process, right, our team is exercising, they're patriotic exercising, right? And they've had experience then, and they're seasoned soldiers because they've seen that through. We then need to turn that towards real election integrity. And, you know, politicians want to pass something that means virtually nothing so that they can go back to their constituents and say, hey, we passed the, you know, and they'll call it the massive election reform bill of 2021 that does virtually nothing, right? But it has that title to it. So what we need to do then is use that team effort that we've built to put in real election integrity. And the JBS, again, has wonderful tools on this aspect. And a couple things that we need to look at are this. One, we need to reduce and or eliminate, to the extent possible, early voting, because this is open season on fraud to get that done. So we need to get rid of that. We need to make sure that absentee ballots have a couple characteristics. One, that it's not a free-for-all where counties can just send out absentee ballots to whomever, but that absentee ballots have to be requested, and you have to have like legitimate, valid reason for an absentee ballot, right? I mean, if somebody has medical conditions and they're a shut-in, well, you know what, that's a valid reason, but let's have safeguards then in place. I mean, you know, if I have a title and I'm going to transfer title to a car, I get a notary stamp on it. Well, I mean, let's get a notary stamp on an absentee ballot too. That's not that hard. We can accomplish that. So we can do some things along those lines once we have a team in place that's strong, to then carry that team forward to do some things like that. Among other things, right? There should be paper ballots that are auditable, right? So that we can check afterwards, right? If there's a precinct that's got 615 eligible voters, but 900 votes have been cast in that precinct, well, we know something's wrong there, and we need to have an audit track on that going forward. We need to make sure that the votes are counted at that precinct level. This isn't something where everything's shoved in a, you know, a sealed box and sent off to a central location. No, each one of those precincts needs to count them on site and report them on site. And we need to have a system that says, hey, each precinct is going to hold release of their vote totals until all precincts are ready to release them, right? So we don't have, urban centers that are waiting around to see what the rural vote is so that they can figure out what number they need to overcome whatever the vote was in those rural areas. So we can make some common sense reforms along that. And of course, we have technology to make sure that we have good observers, both live and virtual, right? I mean, I'm staring at a camera right now and talking to you good folks on something that costs like $35. I mean, for crying out loud, I'm guessing that the government can afford that. To put a camera in place to allow us to observe these things as well. So I've just hit on a couple highlights of some aspects of real election reform, but I can tell you that's going to be a tough nut to crack. And I wouldn't necessarily suggest that, unless you have a well-seasoned team, you can expect to not have all of your efforts turned and rerouted and made for nothing. I would say that you need to build a well-seasoned team first and then try to, cross that bridge, or else, you're going to end up like Churchill in the Dardanelles with a total mess and, without the necessary forces to actually see it through the process. And that's the key thing is if you lead your troops into a battle that's a hopeless slaughter, like Charge of the Light Brigade, you're going to lose the confidence of your forces and they're not going to support you because you're not a very good leader. We got to make sure that we're picking the right battles. And that doesn't mean give up and cede ground. That means find the right battles to build your forces. Right. And then understand that success begets success. And that as you have that success, your army will grow so that you can then take on those larger battles.
Good idea. Wonderful. For sure. Win the little ones first and get everyone enthusiastic. Let's ask another question. Someone else had their hand up.
Trish, go ahead.
Go ahead, Trish.
I'm in Georgia, and we've talked to our legislatures about nullification, and they always act like it's a treasonous act. What can we do to persuade them that it's not, other than go to the Constitution and show them the 9th and the 10th? Is there anything else? They always act like we'll be committing treason if we do nullification.
Yeah,
I mean,
so I think, it's important to maybe take them back to history. And, you can actually get, online a copy of the Treaty of Paris, which shows that, hey, Georgia was named specifically as a independent sovereign state. So this isn't an aspect of treason. This is an aspect of exercising appropriate lawful authority. And I would remind them and actually make sure that they understand the 9th and 10th Amendments. And that this isn't just flowery language that means nothing. These were amendments that are passed, that were adopted, that are part of our Constitution. A lot of times when I hear, members of the legislature say that, what I understand and know is that they don't know what the 9th and 10th Amendments are. And I would, and you got to find the right diplomatic way to challenge their knowledge on that. But you have to understand, too, the process by which a lot of people get to the state legislature, right? When I first started interacting with state legislatures, I had made the assumption that these were really smart, astute people that got to this office because they had great knowledge about the Constitution and about politics. And what I found is that none of that's true. No, they got there because they kept showing up to the Lincoln dinners and helping out, and they had a nice smile, and maybe they had a business with some name recognition, and that the county chairman of the party decided, hey, you know what, your family business has some name recognition, so why don't you run for state rep, because it'll cost us less money to get you elected if you already have some name recognition from, other business aspects. And they've got basically a fourth grade education on civics that exists, and not much beyond that. So, the key thing though is to not be right in their face and yelling at them and telling them how wrong and stupid they are. You've got to build relationships. So what I would say is find a way to create some common ground so that you're actually getting listened to and you're not sort of like talking over their heads, and then start feeding them information that makes sense and historical information that makes sense. And here again is where the John Birch Society is really special, because we've got just fantastic pieces on the history of nullification and what that's all about. There's a wonderful book called The Doctrine of Lesser Magistrates as well that educates, and you can't necessarily assume that a state legislator is going to read that. In some cases, you wonder if they can read at all, quite honestly, but at least it arms you with the right way to express your words in such a way that'll connect. One of the things that I love about some of the videos we've made about the John Birch Society is the succinct way we're able to phrase things that make sense. So, I've watched Overview of America probably 100 times, if not more, because Jack McManus does such a wonderful way of presenting the Constitution and presenting free market economics in an economy of words that just hits home so well. Right. And so you may even have to start with that by saying, hey, let's have a cup of coffee and, bring your iPad and, show them sections or the whole thing of Overview of America and watch it with them together and create those bridges, because you have to make sure that you're at some point speaking on the same terms and lingo, or else it goes right over their head. But again, the key thing is you want to build the bridge so that you can not talk over their head, but talk to them and then bring them up on the education of it. And the good news here is that we're right. Our history and our knowledge of the legal application of the Constitution is bang on correct, right? So it's a process, but we can get them there. You just have to find the right diplomatic way to get there.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Another question?
Yeah, if I might, Robert. What's your tactic when you come up against someone who is just diametrically opposed to our ideas and they have their agenda and it's progressive?
Well, I try to make sure that, so let me back up and say this. When I was a trial lawyer, you only get so many preemptory strikes, right? So if you've got a bad juror and you can't get them off with the strike, you just try to make sure that you can put them in a position where they're not going to lead others down their same path of thinking, right? So if, for example, you've got a member of a subcommittee that they're just absolutely opposed to you, they're not going to in any way support your position, what you need to do is find a way to take their position, rephrase it in testimony to the subcommittee, like if you're testifying on a bill, and point out all these significant logical errors that exist with it so that the other members of the subcommittee can see how their logic fails, right? And you're going to get that, right? So, that's why in many cases, when we're looking at getting a bill through a committee, right, we're focusing on only those people that we need to get the vote and get it through committee, right? We don't have to have a unanimous win on this thing. We just need enough votes to get it through. And so we're going to focus all of our efforts on those people that are going to get us that bill through. But in the meantime, because sometimes you have fence sitters and you need them to vote your way, you can just make sure that you understand why it is they're diametrically opposed to you and call that out in such a way that you can show the historical, legal, and logical disconnect that their position embraces.
Let's take one more question. Anybody who has visited a congressman or assemblyman or sheriff and has seen any of the aspects of it that Robert talked about tonight.
One thing too, Ed, that I can do is
Yes.
the testimony that I gave on one of our nullification bills in Ohio
Yeah.
is saved on the internet, and so I can give you a link to share with everybody as well, so that they can see sort of specifically the points that were made and how they were made, and you can see where things are being resignated. I was actually cross-examined by one of the Democrats, who was the ranking Democrat on the board, and I welcomed her questions because I was able to hit them out of the park. And I think if you go to that, my testimony starts at the just before the 200 mark, and I think on that website it'll list sort of all the things that happens, and it has markers, and you can scroll down there, and it will indicate, I think it's at 159:40 where my testimony specifically started on the nullification bill.
Excellent, excellent. And thank you for the handouts. By the way, I'll send those handouts, folks, those templates, the one dealing with Second Amendment, the other one dealing with general nullification. I'll send those handouts out to you again. I sent them out with the notification of this meeting, but I'll send them out again in our follow-up. So you'll be able to make sure you have them. This is what we're going to be talking about more and more, folks. And we need to be talking about it with our legislators. We have about 19 people locally that have volunteered to go see their elected officials. And so find out who your elected official is. One of the things, I had a call today and people didn't know quite who their elected official was. One of the ways to do that is go to jbs.org and go into our Act Now section, go into the state issues. And under there, if you put your zip code in and your address, you can find out who your state senator is. We call them state senators and assemblymen here. And in our towns, we have town supervisors. So in the area where I live, Saratoga County, each of the town supervisors then makes up the county legislature. So you got an opportunity, if you can influence the supervisor in your town and the town board, to actually see that carry through to the county level. So there's great opportunity we have in upstate New York, in rural areas. Great opportunity indeed. And it's just it's no less conservative than in some of the areas that in Ohio that where Robert has made this happen. So we need to get to work in that regard.
Yeah, I note in Pennsylvania they've had a lot of liberal progressivism in it, but as I'm told by those that live in the state, Pennsylvania is Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and in between is Alabama.
Well, yeah, in many ways that's very, very true. It's hunting and fishing in the middle of the state, right? One of the biggest bear populations in America. Okay. Thank you so much, Robert. You want to any comment to close?
No, thank you very much. And one of the things that I want to maybe leave with is this. We talk at the John Birch Society about individual responsibility. And so we need to understand that, our success is not going to be in feeling good about these meetings or getting informed. That's important to get informed and know what we're talking about and know the rules, but it can't end there. Being the best informed member of a concentration camp is no position of honor. So in particular, one of the key things that has been part of the John Birch Society for as long as I can remember is the 110-6 program, right? We have to have individual responsibility to take ownership of 100 households. right? That we're going to be hitting at least 2-3 times a year with information and making sure that we develop relationships with those people. That there's going to be 10 influencers, people that have a large sphere of um, a large sphere of people like pastors and business owners and those types of things, or even state legislatures that we're constantly, at least quarterly, if not more, constantly engaging with. And that we have 6 people that we're recruiting, that we're constantly recruiting for membership to add to our ranks. Understand things like the backpack bill, where we can get kids out of this critical race theory and out of the 1619 project. The teacher unions aren't going to sit around and say, oh, shoot, look what they did. No, they're going to fight back, right? Election integrity, the last thing that politicians want is actual election integrity. They don't want any part of that. Right? They want to make sure their jobs are secured first and foremost. So these are going to be fights that we have to recruit fellow soldiers to. So let me end with this. If you haven't been diligent in the 110.6 aspect of your individual responsibility, I just want to make a reminder that that is critical and that is a key piece of what's going to win this fight. And if we're shirking our duty there, we need to know that, hey, it's time to redouble our efforts because our country needs it and our republic is worth it. Thank you, Ed. I really appreciate the time.
Thank you so much. And God bless you, Robert, and all your efforts. And thank you for your sacrifices. Really appreciate it. I'm gonna send just a comment on the 110.6 program. We've talked about it for years, and a few of our members do it, but most don't. So I'm gonna send it out again, the blank for that 110.6 program. And I'll also send you the portion out of our leader's manual that tells you how to implement that 110.6 program. So we're going to do that as a reminder since Robert mentioned it. And each of you read that material and start doing it, because that will result in new people in our Army. It'll result in new people, many more new people than even the ones we're getting now. So thanks so much on that. Thank you, Robert. I'm going to